Yet. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, and hello to those of you watching this recording later. My name is Dr. Joshua Evans. I am the research lead for the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab, and I will be moderating this panel session today. Before we begin, all of you should be muted upon entry, but I just want to remind you to keep your microphones muted. And also, if you're just attending, if you could turn your video off for now, that would be much appreciated. There is a chat feature that is being monitored by Laura, and you can use this chat box to pose questions during this panel session. However, we're going to keep questions until the very end, until after our four panelists have spoken. Before introducing the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab and our panelists, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. The Affordable Housing Solutions Lab is a social innovation space where citizens can work collectively to identify local housing needs and co-develop creative and well-matched solutions for the public benefit. The lab itself is a joint initiative of the University of Alberta and MacEwan University, and it is supported by funds from the City of Edmonton. Today's panel on the right to housing in Alberta emerged out of discussions with a group of lab fellows, some of whom are here today, who have been working together over the past 6 months with Laura and myself to identify housing needs in the community and identify potential solutions. And the right to housing came up continually in our discussions over the past 6 months, as did a number of other questions, such as what is the right to housing? How are these rights protected in Edmonton? And what work remains to be done? And so this panel was organized to kick off a conversation in response to these questions. Today we have organized 4 panelists. Each panelist will have roughly 10 minutes or so to speak. And after our panelists have spoken, we will open the meeting for questions and comments. So what I'd like to do now is just to introduce our 4 panelists, and then I will turn it over to them for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for some questions and some general discussion. And we aim to end today at around 1:30 p.m. So to introduce our panelists, I'll begin with Damian Collins. Damian Collins is a professor in the Human Geography program at the University of Alberta, who is interested in homelessness and housing, especially from a policy perspective. Damian believes that housing is a universal human right, and this understanding influences his work on topics such as housing first and eviction prevention. Damian is also the director of the Community Housing Canada Research Partnership, which aims to increase the sustainability and resilience of social and affordable housing in Canada. Welcome, Damian. Next, we have Sarah Eadie. Sarah is a staff lawyer at the Edmonton Community Legal Centre, where one of the biggest practice areas is representing tenants in disputes with their landlords. Sarah was also a member of the End Poverty Edmonton Task Force from 2014 until 2018, and past chair of End Poverty Edmonton's Justice and Democratic Participation Working Group. Welcome, Sarah. Next, we have Roxanne Eulenick. Roxanne is a woman with a disability who represented Canada in the 1988 Paralympics in Seoul, South Korea, playing wheelchair basketball. Since accepting an early retirement in 2005, Roxanne has spent her time advocating and volunteering on behalf of people with disabilities, drawing attention to the need for accessible as well as barrier-free housing in Edmonton. Currently, she gives disability awareness presentations for Voice of Albertans with Disabilities, is co-facilitating Radical Inclusion 2020 with John Humphrey Centre for Peace and Human Rights, serves on boards of 2 nonprofit organizations in Edmonton, and is also a fellow with the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab. Welcome, Roxanne. And finally, Nadine Chalifoux. Nadine has been passionately involved in housing and homelessness advocacy from a young age. She has a wealth of expertise, including firsthand knowledge of the need for affordable, appropriate, accessible, and safe housing. She is an independent advocate, a 2019 ROOP Awards recipient, board member of the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, a member of End Poverty Edmonton's Indigenous Circle, and a fellow with the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab. So I just want to thank all four of our panelists at the outset here for spending their time with us and sharing their knowledge with us this afternoon. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Damian Collins, who is our first panelist. And then we'll hear from Sarah, Roxanne, and Nadine. So Damian, I will just hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh. And thank you for such a warm invitation to, or a warm introduction rather, to today's presentations and discussions. So I'm going to share my screen, my slides. I guess as the academic on the panel today, I'm the one who inevitably brings the slides, right? And what I'd like to do today is to talk about the background, really, for the human right to housing, technically called the human right to adequate housing, which is an important qualification, I think, and something we could talk about a little bit more as we keep going. And I'll be drawing on my recent work in my role as the Director of Community Housing Canada, although I've been interested in the human right to adequate housing for quite a long time. And I'd like to talk about where it comes from, and in particular how it works at the international level. And then some of our speakers who will be coming after me will talk about maybe more of the practicalities within Edmonton, within Alberta. So I guess, first of all, when we think about housing as a human right, I guess the first question that comes to mind might be why? Why would we want to think about housing in that way? And I would argue it's because of the absolutely central place of housing in our lives. It's something that's absolutely critical to our day-to-day existence and our day-to-day well-being. And it doesn't take long to start thinking about all the ways in which housing is so important to everyday life, and how it's central to our dignity, our autonomy, that is our ability to be independent, to our health and well-being. It's a source of identity, not identity. It helps us with our goals in life. It ties us to places like our neighborhoods, for example. And equally important, having adequate housing is a bedrock for realizing other human rights. For example, the right to health is something that is dependent upon having adequate housing. And another way to sort of think about the importance of housing and why we might want to conceptualize it as a human right is to think about what it's like to live without housing, right? So just to flip that on its head. And there's a famous in academic circles, a famous essay that was written by a legal scholar, Jeremy Waldron, in 1991. And he pointed out that everything that is done has to be done somewhere, which is a simple but quite profound observation, really. And so if you lack a place of one's own, a home, then you are comprehensively unfree. And I actually went to a talk this morning that helped to illustrate this in quite a powerful way. It was talking about the possessions of people who are precariously housed, people who are living without homes, but also people who are perhaps couch surfing or in other various precarious forms of rental housing. And the personal possessions of those folks, their clothing, their utensils, their identification is always precarious as well, because they don't have that somewhere, that critical somewhere, a place of their own to store their possessions safely. And so, although we might think about, the right to enjoy one's possessions as being important, and I think that's something that's important to all of us, if you don't have a home, or at least a place that's reliable, a place that's yours, a place that's that you can depend upon, then you're not actually free to enjoy your possessions. Your possessions might be taken from you at any time. Most noticeably, of course, if you're camping while experiencing homelessness. And so I thought that was a really interesting and powerful example of what it's like when you don't have the autonomy and the ties to place that a home brings with it. And then I guess we could say, why a right? Well, rights exist to protect things that are important to human beings, to independence, to our essential qualities as human beings. And more specifically, and in a more formal legal sense, the right to housing comes from the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was developed in 1966 and which Canada signed on to a decade later in 1976. And so Article 11 of that convention, which is an international human rights treaty and which has the force of law, says it recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living. And that adequate standard of living includes food, and critically, it includes housing. So this is really where the right to housing was first formalized in international law and framed as part of this right to an adequate standard of living. And, if we were writing this today, we wouldn't include the rather sexist language around himself and his family. But the point, I hope, stands that this is a goal and an aspiration that is important to the international community, including to Canada, and it has been for 45 years. So one of the criticisms of the right to housing, especially at the international level, is that it's vague, that it's aspirational, that it's not really clear what it should or could look like. And that criticism, I would argue, is actually quite misplaced. Since 1966, when the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights was first developed and introduced to the international community, a great deal of work has gone into conceptualizing what the right to housing consists of and what it should look like in practice, so that it's not just some vague aspirational dream, but something concrete that we can all point to. And of critical importance is that there's been 7 components of the right to housing or the right to adequate housing have been identified. And you can see them listed here on the slide. And I mean, I don't, of course, expect that people would necessarily be able to memorize all of these components or to engage with all of them today. But the critical point is that a great deal of work has been done to define what the right to housing really involves. And these are components that matter to all of us, right? Legal security of tenure, number 1, protection against forced eviction and harassment in our homes. Affordability is one of the components which is of the most concern in the Canadian context, especially in Canadian cities, where we know that a significant minority of people live in unaffordable housing. We could talk about habitability, the adequacy of the dwelling, which is especially important at the lower end of the rental market. And we could think about accessibility, especially for persons who have historically been disadvantaged, such as people living with a disability. So these 7 components, which have been identified at the international level, help the international community and the states that have signed on to the International Covenant to realize the right to housing in practice, to ensure that it has some concrete, practical effects, and also so that all of us as the people who hold these rights as individuals, we can see if our rights are being respected or not. So, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Do we know when the right to housing is not being respected? And certainly, the most obvious manifestation of that is homelessness. People who are deprived of housing and experience all the hardships that come from being deprived of housing, of not having a place of one's own, which can include discrimination and social exclusion, but many other things as well, including, as I mentioned previously, as I learned today, the loss of people's personal possessions, which is a real additional hardship that's imposed upon people who don't have their own home. And the international community in interpreting and developing the right to housing has really emphasized in very black and white terms that eliminating human rights, sorry, what a mistake to make. Eliminating homelessness is a human rights priority, right? It's absolutely essential that is something that we undertake as a matter of extreme urgency. Another issue which is relevant in many parts of the world, and also in some parts of the rental sector in Canada, is forced evictions, the removal of people from their homes without appropriate legal protections. So although some evictions are allowed under the international right to housing, forced evictions without legal protections are deemed deeply problematic. And in addition, the international community is clear that evictions should not occur where they are going to result in homelessness. And we know that in practice in Canada and in Alberta, evictions do result in homelessness quite frequently. And so we're not living up to the requirements of the right to housing when that happens. So whenever we think about a right, we might think about the people who hold the right, and that's all of us as individuals, as human beings. But we can also think about who has the duty to respect the right. And so those are sort of two sides of the same coin. And in the first instance, it's governments that have duties to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to housing. We live in a federal state in Canada, and international law is very clear that just because you have a federal state doesn't mean you can avoid the requirements and the necessary steps that are mandated by international law. So it's not purely the responsibility of the federal government, although they have a primary role. Provincial and municipal governments also have a duty to respect the right to housing. Because housing is a complex field where lots of different resources are required, the duty that is owed is one of progressive improvement. So we realize that we might not be able to fix the housing system overnight, but we expect to see progressive improvement over time. It's an absolute requirement that occurs on the basis of non-discrimination against people with disabilities, for example, non-discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and other groups who have been historically and contemporarily disadvantaged in the housing system. And lastly, and this one's really a key point of international law, that states must use the maximum of their available resources to achieve their goals. And, I think there was a time in the not so distant past when Canada was really using the minimum of its available resources. States must also watch what third parties are doing. For example, private actors, community housing providers, landlords must be monitored by the state to ensure that they are not committing human rights abuses. And so what that means really is that everyone in a position of power in the housing system has obligations to ensure that human rights are respected and acknowledged and put into practice. Okay, so that's my brief overview of the right to housing from an international perspective in particular, and I look forward to hearing what other folks have to say.
Thank you very much, Damian. Next, we're going to move to Sarah Eadie. Just give us a moment to transition here. Sarah?
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Damian. Your slides really kicked it off nicely for me, actually, because some of the things that I'm going to talk about tie in really nicely. Just to start off, to acknowledge that in Alberta, the right to housing is not fully recognized, in that we see a lot of breaches of the right to adequate housing. So I think most people would be familiar with the idea that Albertans are often evicted into homelessness, and that we have incredibly long waiting lists for social housing or affordable housing that would be, suitable and safe for people. So we have a lot of situations where people's right to adequate housing is not being respected. But there are some ways in Alberta where tenants do have some rights to housing that are respected, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about two situations where there is a right to security of tenure. So that's something that was talked about a moment ago. Security of tenure, meaning you have a right to continue living in that housing. And so that provides some protection to folks. So the two ways I'm going to talk about are for periodic tenants and for people who live in social housing. The first one, periodic tenants. What that means is people who live in rental housing essentially month to month and don't have a fixed end date for their tenancy. Tenancies can all either be thought of as fixed term or periodic. And if you have an end date, What that means is that the landlord can decide not to renew a tenancy and it will automatically end at the end date. The landlord doesn't need a reason to end a tenancy. So what I see in my work as a lawyer helping tenants is that landlords use fixed term tenancies as a way to control what tenants they have and to pick and choose tenants by reasons that might well be discriminatory. So landlords might enter into a string of fixed term tenancies. And if they find that, might be 6 months at a time on an ongoing basis, but if a tenant is late with rent for a period of time, if they find that they're noisy, any other problem that they might see with a tenant not being ideal, they just won't renew that tenancy. And the way the law is in Alberta is that if a tenancy isn't renewed, it automatically ends. You don't need advance notice and you don't need a reason. And that can create a very stressful situation for tenants because they don't know, maybe on a 6-month basis, every 6 months, if they're going to have housing the next month. So that's very stressful. But tenants who are in periodic tenancies have more security of tenure, meaning landlords can't just end those tenancies at will. So if a landlord decides that they don't like a tenant, but they are in a periodic tenancy or a tenancy without a fixed end date, well, there's only some certain ways they can end that tenancy. If a tenant has done something wrong, if they've substantially breached their tenancy agreement, like they're not paying rent or they've threatened another tenant or something like that, the landlord can go through a procedurally correct eviction and ask a court to end that tenancy and have that person evicted. Or a tenant might agree to move. Sometimes a landlord and a tenant agree to end a tenancy. Or a landlord can end a periodic tenancy for one of very few specific reasons, each of which have their own advance notice period. Those are things like where a tenant is a student and is living in student residence and they're not going to be a student anymore at the end of the notice period, or the whole place is being converted to condos, or the building is being demolished, or the landlord was renting a place to you, but now he wants to move in. So he's going to give you notice that you have to move out because he's moving into his own place. There's, a list of about 8 very specific reasons. And outside of those reasons, if you have a periodic tenancy without a fixed end date, then the landlord can't just choose to end your tenancy. So you have a right to live there on an ongoing basis. Generally, in my experience helping tenants, periodic tenancies are better for tenants because in a periodic tenancy, the tenant can choose to end their tenancy on 1 month notice, but the landlord can't. So tenants have some security of tenure. So the other thing I want to talk about is the security of tenure with social housing. Social housing is a specific legal term that's referring to where a person in Alberta is paying 30% of their income for their rent to their landlord, and they have to provide ongoing updated financial statements and proof of their income to their landlords, and their rent is adjusted depending on how much income they get. And there are special laws that apply. For all tenants renting houses in Alberta, the Residential Tenancies Act is the main law that applies. But if you live in social housing, the Alberta Housing Act and the regulations under that act also apply. The most important one of those is the Social Housing Accommodation Regulation, and that's a mouthful, so we just call it SHAR. And what SHAR does is it sets out a point system to determine priority to social housing. There's definitely not enough social housing. There's a critical shortage of social housing in Alberta and Edmonton. But the main social housing providers, and the main ones in Edmonton are Capital Region Housing Corporation, the Greater Edmonton Foundation, HomeEd, which is the City of Edmonton run one. There's a number of other smaller housing providers. Those landlords must allocate the housing that they have according to the point system. So when someone applies for housing with a social housing provider, the landlord has to assess how many points they have. And the higher the number of points they have, the higher up in priority they are on the list. And what you get points for are things like having more dependents. So if you have one person working and 6 people in the household who are not working, then you've got 6 dependents. You also get more points if there are people with disabilities that aren't being appropriately accommodated in their current housing. You get more points for the higher percentage of your income that you spend on rent right now. You get more points if you're overcrowded. So sometimes, well, there's a whole set of rules around who can share a bedroom, et cetera. And so they look at how many bedrooms you need and how many bedrooms you currently have and how overcrowded you are. You get more points if the accommodation that you're currently living in is detrimental to your health, if it's unsafe or unsanitary. So there's a whole bunch of tables that set out how the points are calculated in the back of that SHAR, or the Social Housing Accommodation Regulation. And whoever gets the most points, well, the next time the landlord has, let's say, a 3-bedroom house, they look and see who are the people who are waiting for a 3-bedroom house, who has the most points, that person is supposed to get the housing. Now, what we saw a number of years ago is that landlords for social housing providers were being sneaky. And while they were allocating housing according to the point system, which is what they were supposed to do, they were entering into fixed term tenancies just like regular landlords. And then if they didn't like a tenant, they were choosing not to renew. So they were kind of going through a backdoor way to pick and choose tenants, which didn't really comply with the spirit of the law. So we were able to successfully argue that that violated the spirit of the law and they couldn't do it. And we didn't have to have a court case because that landlord was Capital Region, which is really the biggest social housing provider. And they agreed that it seemed right that they shouldn't be able to stop renting to somebody in social housing just because they didn't like them. So they stopped using fixed term tenancies, or if they did use them, they just couldn't not renew them at the end of them. Unfortunately, we're still fighting that with smaller landlords in court. So I say, we think we have security of tenure in social housing. We probably do, but we don't have a court decision. So we kind of wait until the judge confirms it. But we have been able to successfully convince the biggest social housing provider to stop doing that. And what I think the law is that we do have security of tenure once you're into social housing. Once you've gotten to that top of that priority list, and you do get housing, you get to continue living there unless and until you no longer meet the requirements, or the landlord evicts you through a procedurally correct way because you've done something that substantially breaches it. So the takeaway from what I have to say today is there are a lot of problems with the right to adequate housing in Alberta. It's true that we don't have rent control, we don't have enough social housing, we don't have enough supportive housing, and tenants are evicted all the time with nowhere to go. But we do have security of tenure in 2 specific ways. For periodic tenants, whether they have a written lease or not, just those tenants who are on a month-to-month basis have security of tenure, and tenants who are living in social housing have a security of tenure. So that's all the time I had today, and that's what I wanted to talk about. I think Roxanne is next.
Thank you, Sarah. Over to you, Roxanne.
Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm a little nervous about today, just because I'm not a professional. I'm somebody who's been looking for housing for 35 years. So I'm here just to kind of share some of my story with you today, hoping it'll inspire all of you to include people who use mobility aids in our housing designs moving forward. So there's just no way in a few minutes to kind of capture the depth of this issue. And I've been telling my story over and over and over again for over 20 years. But I'm an independent woman who uses a wheelchair full time. I grew up in a farm in northeastern Alberta. I moved to Edmonton in 1986 to get post-secondary and play competitive wheelchair basketball. But housing was an issue from day one. It took me until 2004 to find adequate housing. But in my young mind, as a young person moving to the big city to play wheelchair basketball, I made this assumption that if I could play wheelchair basketball internationally, I certainly should be able to move to the big city and find housing and live a good life. But that was not the case. I did go to Korea and compete in the Paralympics, which was an amazing experience. I was very honored and felt very proud to be a Canadian, and felt like I was living my best life. But coming home and then starting my real life, college and housing, I struggled for the next 15 years to find housing. I always had a roof over my head, but I constantly had to negotiate with landlords and roommates to overcome barriers. When I did look for housing, which I did in 20 years, I think I moved like 18 times. The choices that always came up for me were always inadequate. They were never in the right location. They were never completely accessible. I always had to sacrifice something. And in the end, what that meant was my career is what I ended up sacrificing, because I had no energy. I was using all my energy in inaccessible housing. And then I didn't have enough to really pursue a career. And with that, with not having adequate housing, I started suffering from chronic depression in like 1995. So I spent 6 years tackling that and finding some good help here. And then just as I was recovering from clinical depression, I found accessible housing. In 2004, I found Art Space Housing Cooperative, which I think all of you would term as social housing. I'm not sure. But Art Space is a housing development on the east side of downtown Edmonton. It consists of an 8-story high-rise and a row of townhouses. 29 out of the 88 units are adapted for people who use wheelchairs. Art Space also owns a home care company, which provides services authorized and funded by Alberta Health Services. These services make it possible for many people with disabilities to live independently, as opposed to living in long-term care or in unhealthy codependent relationships. Our members with disabilities are able to participate more in the community, whether it be working or volunteering. We have a couple of members here that would be in long-term care if they didn't find Art Space, and they are working full-time. And I don't even think that would be possible from a care facility. Simply, we use less healthcare dollars by sharing our resources as a community. This housing development opened for tenants in 1990. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a lot built since, at least not accessible. And the wheelchair accessible units rarely come available for rent. Those of us that live here joke about the fact that the only way you live here or leave here is in a coffin, because no one moves out because there's literally nowhere else to go. And I know, because I look for it still today. A majority of our members have very sad stories about where they lived before finding Art Space. One of our most recent members had been living in a hospital for 5 months because there was nowhere that could accommodate him. Luckily, I ran into him at a community meeting and hooked him up. But again, that just was by chance because we had an empty unit, which doesn't happen very often. So I just want to say that housing is essential to living a good life here in Canada. Everyone should have access to housing that enables them to live independently and pursue work and or careers or volunteer work. I retired at the age of 36 for medical reasons, and I believe that the lack of accessible housing was a major barrier to success. I've done most of my advocacy work since I've found accessible housing myself. People who are marginalized by housing cannot be expected to advocate for themselves when they are experiencing such a lack of freedom and mobility. Even today, conversations around accessible housing unnerve me because I think the conversation will be reduced to how we can do more with less money and reducing my life to a dollar sign. The thing I just want to mention is that, I grew up with my disability, and I feel like there was a social contract made with me as a kid because I did everything asked of me. I did all the rehab, everything. Plus I went to school, I got good grades, got a driver's license, went to school. I did everything that I'm supposed to do as a responsible citizen. And yet there's no place for me to live. And it's unreasonable, although my family set me up as best as they could. Coming from rural Alberta, I had a vehicle to drive, and I thought, well, I'll rent housing until I get my career off and start saving money. Well, that didn't happen. for so many reasons. So I just want to see us support. I mean, I'm really speaking for youth with disabilities and giving them a chance to have meaningful lives here in Alberta. I do recognize that we actually didn't live to adulthood. We're like, I'm one of the first generations that grew up, you know, has lived my entire adult life using a wheelchair. It's a rare occurrence before this generation, and it's because we have amazing rehab and healthcare here in Alberta. So people with disabilities need to be meaningfully included in society because it is a violation of our rights and just irresponsible not to include us, because we cost everybody a lot of money when our needs aren't met. Housing is the solution, not the problem, and appropriate housing would save our healthcare dollars like astronomical amounts of money, and could potentially reduce taxes for everybody. And so that's about all I have to say today. I hope that was helpful to all of you. And I'd love to chat more if any of you are interested. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Roxanne, for your sharing. I'm sure there are many questions and comments. We're going to move to Nadine Chalifoux next.
Hi, everybody. Just fixing this here. So my name's Nadine Chalifoux. I am Indigenous, but considered Métis. It's like a lot of red tape to decide what you are or be declared government-wise what you are. However, Indigenous people, whether they're Métis or full Indigenous, we all suffer the same thing when it comes to housing. Once we move off of the reserved land that is for us, we become an urbanized Indigenous person. Many Indigenous come to urban areas to seek education, to seek employment, because there is a lack of employment or job opportunities on the reserves. We have to not just, fight our own systemic barriers within our culture, but we fight a lot of other systemic issues which have become more so political and somewhat abused as a reason to advocate or activists. We have this issue that people think that if they state a certain thing, that makes everything all better for the hundreds of years that we have been abused. So most Indigenous, when it comes to housing, they fight more than just one barrier, one idealistic options, whether they're working full-time or not, if they're on the income support or AHSL, or whether they work full-time, have families, almost all of them have the same trauma they have because of housing. People have disallowed them to live in places. So our needs and concerns have to put up with racism, unequal representation for advocacy, which includes colonialism, a negative, description or perception of who Indigenous people are. And that's mostly through press and politics. Intergenerational trauma, which includes like genocide, residential schools, and 60 Scoop, urbanism, and finding housing that doesn't abuse our rights and choose that they just don't want us in their housing. Racism being the biggest thing, especially now with the rise of the Black Lives Matters and BIPOC communities standing up for each other. overall, it still does not stretch out to housing. It does not impact housing enough. Like disabilities, Indigenous people fight to have affordable and adequate housing. I have a friend who has a family of 7, and she lives in a 2-bedroom townhouse that charges her quite a lot. Her husband works as best he can, but he's from the oil field. So obviously right now during COVID, he has very little work, if any. Even with relief funding, it's not enough to support them. They've been trying for 4 years to get a home that's big enough that they can afford. And every time they find one, they get turned down. And 9 out of 10 times they've applied for places, the people didn't want them there because they were Indigenous. And it was never so much as said to them, it was more implied. But when you're Indigenous, you know the looks you get, you know the answers that you get for questions, how they're worded, and you know if you're being discriminated against. But how do we prove that we can't get this housing because we're being discriminated because of racism? When it comes to private corporations like Boardwalk, Main Street, so forth, they don't have to comply government-wise to who they rent to. I mean, it's our rights to have housing and nobody should judge us for that, but it happens every day to thousands of people and families. With that being said, because of negative press, negative politics against Indigenous people, we're deemed unfit, unhealthy, not socially capable of holding housing. We're deemed drug users, gang members. It goes on and on and on. And in the city, it's so bad that even someone like me who's Métis and is quite pale compared to my family and cousins, I've even been carted on the street and abused that way many times. I know the system's trying to change, but until actual change happens, it doesn't mean anything. There's all the kindness in the world is great, but it doesn't help us get the appropriate recognition that we deserve. The government of Canada thinks that writing up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, these are legal documents. These are documents that are supposed to be adhered to, just like our treaty documents are supposed to be adhered to. It's supposed to be an equal relationship. None of these actually have the effect that they needed to have. They've only recognized specific groups within our own culture that need to be apologized to, I guess you could say, which is where they created the 60s scoop, which is Indigenous that were taken from their homes and given to white folks to adopt them, even though their families were good and capable of raising them. And then the residential schools genocide or system also took children from Indigenous families who could care for them quite well and placed into schools run by Catholic, the Catholic system. And often children were killed being in that system because they didn't I guess change to the way the white people and Catholics wanted them to. They didn't want to give up their culture, their beliefs, their traditions, their family, the way they looked, the way they dressed. And because of that, many were killed. Too many, in fact. And then the overall genocide, including the pox being released to the Indigenous people through infected blankets from colonial travelers, knowingly giving these sick blankets to these people. It nearly wiped out a good portion of our culture. And sadly, there was no coming back from that. All of these things have impacts on how we access many things, including our housing. With housing, not only do we have to prove that we are civilized people, but we are people who have good work ethics, have good family ethics. We have to be the pinnacle poster child for the social system. I noticed that Sarah had said that we cannot be evicted because of who our race, our culture, because the tenant doesn't like us because of those things, but it happens every day. I'm helping people fight that every day. And like Roxanne said, it's hard to find adequate housing. So if you're Indigenous, you have a disability, or anything along those lines, they just stack up against you. And even though social housing has a point system, they still to this day do not adhere to it. If that were the case, I should be in social housing instead of, well, I thought it was social housing, but it's apparently near market housing run by a social housing corporation. These corporations abuse their powers and literally judge the people who are coming in, not by their circumstance, but by their race, their culture. In Edmonton today, 48% of all homeless people are Indigenous. They have a hard time getting out of homelessness, and a lot of times they're in homelessness is because of the system failing them, the system judging them, the system putting them last on the list to work with. It gives them the chance to lose trust in the system, lose faith, lose hope. And when you lose those things, you can't possibly get the cooperation you need just to get into a proper house. Unfortunately, I don't see the system changing for Indigenous within the next 5 years. I would like to see it change, but I don't see it change because it's been 45 years and I haven't seen it change. My mom had the same issue trying to house us, and she was often put to the worst buildings possible because of having an Indigenous family. People shouldn't be punished for it, unfortunately. There's a definition based on housing, based on Indigenous people. And it talks about the right to housing. And it was written by Jesse Thistle, who wrote the article on the Homeless Hub. And it just states that Indigenous are not recognized as people. They're not recognized as human beings requiring human rights. And because of that, the governments and the corporations who run housing, whether they're private or social, still see Indigenous as beneath them. I'd like to see this change. I try to help people see this change, but it's a long road to fight for. Other than that, I just think that with people who are of Indigenous descent, they get the ability to be recognized as human beings and given an equal chance to have appropriate housing for their families and for themselves. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Thank you for your sharing. That's very powerful. I really appreciate how you've provided us with some some insight into the challenges facing Indigenous people living in Canadian cities, and also a reminder of just how significant racism is in our housing system, and how it's a problem that should be challenged, and as you say, changed. So thank you for that sharing, Nadine, and I want to thank Roxanne as well. Thank you so much for sharing your story and giving us again some insight into the lived experience of disability and your own personal struggle to find accessible housing. I also really appreciated the example of Art Space and the description that you provided us of a place that has accessibility and the benefits and inclusion that provides to people living there. Sarah, I want to thank you as well for providing us with the detail with regard to security of tenure, and taking us into the nuances of some of this legislation that impacts people's everyday lives. I thought that was really helpful and illuminating. And Damian, thank you so much for providing us with the bigger picture, in terms of how the right to adequate housing it has been understood and framed in legally, and providing us with some concepts, some components for thinking about the right to housing, what that might mean. So on behalf of everyone, I just want to thank the panelists for the sharing that you provided us with today. We do have some time remaining, about 20 minutes. So I really want to give people who are attending here and listening a chance to contribute to this discussion, to pose a question, comments to the panelists. I just want to remind everyone, though, that to practice kindness and consideration for everyone here who's today. And so I just want to invite you to be courteous and respectful in the discussion that's forthcoming here. So you have a number of options if you'd like to pose a question. There's the chat box where you can type in a question. I know Laura's been in the chat box. I've seen some people who've already added some comments in response to what they've heard today, which is fantastic. So you can add a question there and Laura will bring it forward. But if you'd like, you can also enable your microphone and pose a question live. So there's a number of options here.
I have a question for Sarah, if we have.
Yes. Go ahead, Roxanne.
So I'm curious, Sarah, you mentioned the social housing, I guess it's an act or a law that we have in place, but I'm confused by the near market housing, because I had a friend who was living in a home ed building with a disability and living on AHSL and was being charged 46% of her income. And I don't know, I finally begged and pleaded and got her to move here. So now she's living a much better life and has more quality, but I'm just curious as to how that happens.
Yeah, I definitely cannot defend near market housing. It's not social housing at all. It's something really different. And I've heard lots of problems with the management at home ed. I've had lots of people come through and express problems. Of course, I wouldn't hear about it if there were no problems. So, we are trying to help people and provide them with the best advice and in some cases representation to help them with problems that they're having. But that near market housing or affordable housing, it's an entirely different beast from social housing. And what they say is it's usually 10% less than what it would cost. But my experience is often the quality is a little subpar. So, well, maybe it's 10% off the average price for a 2-bedroom. It's maybe not 10% off the price of that 2-bedroom that 2-bedroom could actually rent for at market housing. It looks a lot more like just regular everyday housing.
So, and I have one more question for you. Maybe you would know, because again, this same friend, the place she was living before the home ed building, but this is all was through government programs. She uses a walker full time, and she was given a basement suite. She had to carry her walker up and down 8 stairs every single day. So how is it that these government programs are allowing people with disabilities like to live without access? Like, I don't know. I'm just curious if there's.
Yeah, I can't defend that either. I think it's just a real shortage of housing stock. So there has been an attempt by the federal government in particular to invest in some new housing options in Alberta and in Edmonton. It's not going to fix the problem, but it is going to put a dent in it. It's going to make a difference for those people who are able to get units in the new housing. All I can say is it is one of the considerations when people are on the wait list for social housing. So if you have a disability and the place that you're living in is not suitable to your needs, that gets you extra points. But there just aren't enough units that are accessible. So people are waiting, forever. I know it's so all we can do, all people like me can do, is try to help people stay housed when they're in housing, try to help prevent evictions when we can, and maybe talk to our MPs and our MLAs and encourage them to invest in more social housing and supportive housing, because that would make such a big difference.
Well, thank you for the work you do.
Yeah, I'm lucky to have the job I have, for sure. It's a pretty good job.
My name is Ali. Thank you very much. The panelists, the people who, prepare it, and Damian and Sarah and Roxanne and Nadine, thank you. And one thing that when we talk about discrimination or little bit, people who have the English language, if those people are struggling how to communicate with the landlord or facing this, how about the newcomers who, beside employment, also having a language issue? And the landlord or the property management or the caretaker see them as second class, and they can't complain because they don't know how to navigate the system. So the issue is not only indigenous or other, but mainly the immigrant and the refugees. There are some landlords who take advantage because they say they don't know where to go and how to complain. That's also one main factor that my colleagues, Mulki Ali, who's here, and Muhammad Ayash, who I invited today, are always involved. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Ali. Another reminder that there's a number of vulnerable populations and communities in Edmonton, and newcomers are among those. And the language barriers are certainly put them at a significant disadvantage and render them vulnerable to exploitation by landlords. And so that's a helpful reminder. And I'm wondering, I know the multicultural health brokers provide some support for newcomers. I'm wondering, Sarah, are you aware of other supports for individuals or households like Ali was describing?
Well, there's a gap. There's a problem with, like, for example, translation services. So we do see, just like he's describing all the time, people who are coming in to us and they're being, the landlord, maybe Capital Region Housing or another social housing provider, is applying to evict them. And what's underlying that is a communication difficulty because of a language barrier. So I see that, I get that. That happens all the time. So often, for example, a landlord will send out written communication that says you have to provide us with, updated income information showing what your family income is in order to continue to be eligible for social housing, and you must do it within 30 days. And so somebody doesn't understand what that says, or they don't get it because you might have a multi-generational household, and somebody might just misplace or that letter, and it might not get to the people that need to get it, and then you don't provide the things they're asking for in 30 days, and suddenly they're applying to evict you, and they say, well, we sent 3 letters and they did nothing, they're terrible tenants. They just sometimes seem to not get like, that's not sufficient to send a letter in English. Like, send someone out, go talk to people, figure out what's going on. So I hear it, and I don't know a whole lot of support organizations. We work with multicultural health brokers too, so I know how great they can be in providing some supports. We see newcomers that have come getting support from places like Catholic Social Services or the Mennonite Center, but they're maybe not getting the same level of advocacy that they might get from the multicultural health brokers. People can call and get legal advice from the ECLC if they're low income, but they're going to need, help in translation because we're limited in our ability to help translate too.
I think my colleague Mulka Ali works for multicultural health brokers, and she has been involved in this. So I would like if she could add something to this.
Thank you, Ali. Yes, multicultural health broker. Actually, I have been working 16 years, almost 17, and we have been doing a lot of advocacy for the community, but the job is never ended, and it's not something we can fight 1 day or 2 days. Need is a lot of strategic to approach different way, and newcomers is not something they come 1 day or 2 days. It's they are coming every other month or every other day. You never know, and their issue is a lot. And at the same time, we are helping even settlement and schooling and housing and income supports and all that, because they have a language barrier, but at the same time, they have way, they can't even talk their own neighbor, not only even the housing, the discriminations they are having from the private companies, but even, affordable housing and community housing, capital region housing, all that, because if they don't know how to talk or communicate with people, the side landlords or the people who's coming, they will have a problem. And they have big numbers, big family, larger family. And, holistically, we are doing and helping the family different way. But the thing is, they really struggling. And us, it's a limited what we are doing too, because, you can't do nothing. And as an organization, we don't even have a way to support like a housing. We can't even help it to the families we are serving every day. So definitely we need to connect it other organizations and other even sectors or mainstream people who is helping housing and talking, and we're not forgetting even the professors who are coming from U of A and who has been even with us talking about these issues, social housing and justice and all that things. And I have been working, if I don't forget it, even I think Laura Murphy, who was working with us different way, connecting and with the city of Edmonton and taking a lot of initiative to helping the families. But still, it's not something that's ending 1 day. It's needed to come together and work together. Professionals and workers and brokers and whoever who is helping the community. That's what I will say. And this discrimination is I have been in Edmonton since 1994. I came when the civil war started Somalia. I was a younger person, but I have family in here. My kids, they went to school in here and went to university. But at the same time, seeing how the housing was changing, especially even city of Edmonton, it was tremendous. It was different. But the thing is, imagine somebody who doesn't who doesn't have ability to talk. The communication is a big thing. Some of the families, they don't know even if they want to have a new number at home, like maybe the mom has a baby and they were 5 people and they become 6, but the house, the unit they have is 2-bedroom. Even they don't know how to ask the community, capital region housing or affordable house, wherever they are going, to ask even they need more extra, even though it's not there. It's not over the night they can get another room or bigger place, but at the same time, they need somebody to help to assist the family. So this is a issue, it's a social justice, social housing, problem is there. So I think this panel today, I was listening and I really grateful to be part, and thank Ali who included me, and listening from Damon, who was talking about how it's working international, nationals, and all that things, and Nadine and Roxanne, what they are saying is something exists, but how we can work. This is, for me, it's a starting point to come together and talk about this issue. That's what I will say.
Thank you so much. And I just want to echo your words in saying that we were hoping that this panel was going to be one of many future conversations that we can have over the next few months on this topic. So I agree with you wholeheartedly there. I was scrolling through the chat forum. There's a number of questions here. One caught my eye here, just that was posed recently to Roxanne. Roxanne, I wonder if you'd mind answering this. And it speaks to, what we've been talking about here in terms of what can be done, what can we do going forward. The question, Roxanne, is what would you advise architect and construction companies to include in their design of accessible units? Things that are often overlooked.
So I just answered Kat, actually, or I think it was Kat. I don't know. There's a couple of questions. So I answered privately, but I'll say it to everybody. My answer was that it goes beyond just accessible units. I could find an apartment building with an elevator, which costs more, I might add, and manage in my own apartment, but I didn't have access to parking. I didn't have access to garbage removal, and I didn't have access to laundry. So all building, it needs to go beyond accessible units. And as Josh knows, I say in some of my writing, every building from this day forward should be barrier-free, period. Because, and I know Nadine mentioned it too, just in one of the comments, I have an entire family of cousins in the city that I never see because I am too old to be carried up a set of stairs. I was fine in my 20s, but now that I'm over 50, no carrying me anymore. So we need access to our families. I've had way too many friends that I've met that they crawl in their family homes. So I don't know how to change this attitude of what that is. But I know for myself, the second I started using a wheelchair, my parents put a ramp on our farmhouse. And then the day they moved to town, my uncle was there building a ramp. And they only had choices of 2 houses in small town Alberta that could even accommodate me. But that was their number one choice. So what I know is there is a lot of families here in Edmonton that their children are living in inaccessible spaces, because there's nothing to choose from. I just want to also say that I have friends, many, many, many friends who would love to choose accessible housing so I could come visit. There's literally no market. I don't know how to convince people who love money that there's money to be made here if we would supply the market. So anyways, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Roxanne. Thank you. Well, we're coming up to 1:30 here. Perhaps, I'd like to just give the panelists one final word here before we conclude. I know there's probably so many questions in the chat that we didn't get to today. And, I think going forward, we're going to plan some forums, some sessions. In the short term, it's likely going to be online, but some forums where we can have more time to actually share, discuss, and pose and answer questions. But for the time being here, given we only have a few minutes left, I thought I'd just throw it back to the panelists. Any concluding thoughts you might have or like to share before we end it today?
I had a thought, Josh, and thank you so much to everyone who's spoken today. And I was reminded first by Nadine and then by Ali and by Roxanne as well, just how many different groups of people are excluded from our housing system. And when you add up all the different groups, it's a lot of people who are experiencing these different forms of exclusion. And it's folks with disabilities, it's Indigenous people, it's newcomers, it's young people, it's seniors. The list could go on. And I think it speaks to the way in which our housing system is just not working for people. There's such a significant number of people for whom housing is not provided in a way that's appropriate and affordable and adequate. And so we have our work cut out for us, I guess, is one thing we could conclude from that.
Thanks, Damian.
Thank you everybody for your kind words. Unfortunately, this has been a systemic issue for longer than I've even lived, and I'm 45. So it blows my mind that these issues cannot be fixed, changed, the way of thinking being changed. I mean, we're in 2021. That's insane. Even for me, I require a walker to get around, but I live in capital regions, so-called near market housing. And for 5 or 6 years, I've been trying to get into their social housing, but I'm 1 point away from being allowed to go into it. To me, that's ridiculous. And even now, so with the government, the provincial government, they're cutting a lot of my income and many people's income and income support and dependence on income support. We're all getting money cut from us. So now my income is near 60% of my rent, or my rent is 60% of my income. So to me, I don't know why that doesn't garner me more points to be able to move into housing that I can actually afford and live, because there's no way I can live on what I get. And come March 1st, I may be even less. So I think this whole system of adequate, affordable, appropriate, safe, all of these types of housing, it needs to happen now, because people in my situation are going to become homeless because of the situation, even if they're not supposed to be evicted. Where I still see people getting evicted because their income is being cut and there's no way to gain income. We're obviously on income support permanently for a reason, but that is not included in the decision making of keeping our income the way it is.
Thank you, Nadine. Yeah, it's a good reminder that, we talk about housing and we can't forget that incomes is a significant and important piece of this puzzle. Any last words before I call it to an end here? We're at just about 1:30.
Just want to say that
add one thing. I will say 6,000 people they are in waiting list in capital region housing, and it still is going and growing a lot. What I will say is, people who is talking about and supporting and fighting for the social housing, they have to include it how the government can help, not only even community housing, which is a social housing, but at least even affordable housing who can get the family, and and because some of the people, the way Nadine mentioned it, they are going. Some of the families I'm supporting really, they are even homeless right now because they leave other family, and how long they can be there. That's very, very hard, and we don't want that happen to the community, and at the same time, and Edmontonian. So it will be great if we can even talk about that issue, because it's invisible, nobody knows, but it's growing a lot. Yeah.
Great suggestion. Thank you. Roxanne, did you want to have the final word?
Just that in the end, it all comes down to dignity, and we all deserve to live a life with dignity.
Dignity. That's a great way to end today's session. This will be posted. This recording will be posted on the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab website, and that's at affordablehousingsolutionsLab.ca. And we will circulate that link if you'd like to forward this recording on. This is the first of many other conversations to come, and so we look forward to seeing you back again to continue this discussion on the right to housing and the housing system here in Edmonton. So until then, thank you so much for your time. I want to thank the panelists for your sharing and your knowledge and insights this afternoon. And I wish you all a great day and a great week. Bye for now, everyone. Thank you.